What if the history we've been taught is incomplete? What if the rich, powerful, and vibrant history of Africa has been hidden or overlooked for centuries? Too often, Africa is reduced to stories of poverty, war, and colonization. But what if the real story is much more complex and far more fascinating? Africa is not simply a land of struggle and conflict. It is a land of innovation, empire, science, and art. For centuries before colonization, African societies flourished and contributed significantly to human civilization. Yet, the history we're familiar with doesn't paint a full picture. It's time to examine the Africa that predates colonization, the Africa of kings, empires, and intellectual achievements. It's time to revisit Africa's history, not just as a victim of exploitation, but as a powerful and complex continent that has shaped the course of human history for thousands of years. Africa's power before the colonial era. Africa's story is often narrated from a Eurocentric perspective, its history beginning with the transatlantic slave trade and ending with the scramble for Africa during the colonial period. This narrative has obscured the vast and sophisticated cultures, kingdoms, and empires that existed long before the arrival of Europeans. To understand Africa's true legacy, we must look back to the great African empires and kingdoms that shaped global trade, intellectual thought, and civilization. Consider the Kingdom of Kush, one of Africa's most prominent ancient civilizations. The Kushites not only ruled over Egypt at different points in history, but they also built their own impressive monuments, including the famous pyramids of Nubia, some of which predate those in Egypt. The Kingdom of Kush was a civilization that spanned several centuries, stretching from modern-day Sudan to parts of Egypt, and it thrived from around 1070 BC to 350 AD. The Kushites were masters of ironwork, architects, and military strategists, and their empire controlled the valuable trade routes along the Nile River, influencing the cultures of both Egypt and the Mediterranean world. The great empires of West Africa. Fast forward to the medieval period, and we find some of the most powerful and influential empires in African history, particularly in West Africa. The Mali Empire, which reached its peak in the 14th century, is one of the most famous examples. Under the rule of Mansa Musa, who reigned from 1312 to 1337, the empire became one of the wealthiest and most powerful in the world. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 is legendary. His caravan, which included tens of thousands of soldiers, courtiers, and camels carrying gold, demonstrated to the world the immense wealth of Mali. Mansa Musa's wealth wasn't just symbolic, it was based on gold, which Mali controlled and traded with regions across the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and even Europe. But Mali's significance wasn't just in its wealth. Timbuktu, the capital of Mali, became one of the world's great centers of learning, with universities, libraries, and scholars from across the Islamic world gathering there. The Timbuktu manuscripts, ancient texts that covered everything from medicine and astronomy to law and religion, offer a window into the intellectual vibrancy of West Africa long before European colonialism. Timbuktu, the heart of African knowledge. Timbuktu, often portrayed as a mysterious and magical city in popular culture, was in fact a bustling intellectual and cultural hub. The city's libraries contain thousands of manuscripts, many of which have survived to this day, despite the challenges of time, war, and colonialism. These manuscripts reflect the intellectual achievements of African scholars who were at the forefront of fields like mathematics, science, medicine, and literature. In medieval Africa, scholars in Timbuktu advanced mathematical principles and astronomy that would later influence the European Renaissance. African scholars created astronomical charts, medical texts, and legal codes that were studied across the Islamic world. And yet, these contributions have been largely ignored in favor of the narrative that only Western civilization led to progress and enlightenment. The African trade routes, connecting the world. Africa was not isolated before colonization. In fact, many African kingdoms and empires were central players in global trade networks. West Africa, for example, was a key part of the trans-Saharan trade routes, which stretched across the desert and connected sub-Saharan Africa with the Mediterranean world. These trade routes allowed African kingdoms to exchange gold, salt, ivory, and spices with regions as far away as Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. One of the most significant kingdoms in this trade network was Ghana, located in what is now Mauritania and western Mali. Ghana was an ancient empire that controlled the trade of gold and salt across the desert. Its vast wealth and influence stretched beyond the Sahara, linking West Africa to the Mediterranean world. The trade of gold from Ghana helped shape the world's economic systems and brought wealth and prosperity to the region long before colonial powers set foot on African soil. The hidden legacy of Africa's intellectual contributions. Africa's intellectual legacy is vast and profound, yet largely unrecognized. From the mathematics of the ancient Egyptians to the astronomy of the Mali Empire, African scholars were among the world's leading intellectuals. But even beyond the sciences, Africa's cultural and artistic contributions have had a global impact. African art, including sculptures, textiles, and jewelry, has influenced cultures around the world. African music and dance have shaped global traditions, with rhythms and instruments that are now central to jazz, blues, and other Western genres. Yet, these contributions often go unnoticed or are relegated to the background in favor of more Eurocentric narratives. Africa and the Islamic world. A complex relationship. A more complicated chapter in Africa's history is the relationship between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. As early as the 7th century, the Berbers and Arabs began to interact with Sub-Saharan African societies, bringing Islam with them. While Islamic empires in North Africa, such as the Almoravid and Almohad dynasties, often interacted with Sub-Saharan African peoples through trade and diplomacy, there were also instances of racial prejudice and tension between the two regions. For example, the Berber perspective on black Africans, particularly those from Ethiopia and the Sudan, was often marked by prejudice. The notion that black Africans were inferior to their lighter-skinned counterparts persisted among certain elite circles in the Maghreb, North Africa. However, this prejudice was not universal, and many African Muslims and scholars from Sub-Saharan Africa made their own significant contributions to Islamic scholarship. Reclaiming Africa's true history. Africa's true history is vast and filled with achievements, knowledge, and power. Yet, for too long, it has been overlooked or distorted to fit a colonial narrative that views Africa as a land of savagery and backwardness. In truth, Africa's civilizations predate colonialism and slavery and have left a lasting impact on the world. It's crucial that we reclaim Africa's story, not just as one of suffering but as one of power, innovation, and civilization. African kings, queens, scholars, and traders were central figures in world history long before European powers colonized the continent. From the Kingdom of Kush to the Mali Empire and beyond, Africa's legacy is one of sophistication, intellectual achievement, and global influence. Conclusion: a history buried but not forgotten. The history of Africa is not just waiting to be written, it's been buried, waiting to be remembered. For too long, Africa's powerful civilizations have been overshadowed by a narrative that focuses on the negative aspects of its colonial history. But Africa's past is one of greatness, wealth, and intellectual brilliance, and it's time to acknowledge and celebrate that legacy. By revisiting the incredible achievements of Africa's ancient empires, we can begin to rewrite the story of the continent. A story of trade, intellect, empire, and cultural innovation. The next time we think about Africa, we should remember its true legacy, the legacy of kings, scholars, and innovators who shaped the world long before colonialism and slavery. Thank you for joining me on this journey to rediscover Africa's history. If you found this story inspiring, please consider supporting the channel by subscribing, where we share more insights into Africa's rich legacy. Remember, to truly know where we're going, we must first understand where we come from. Know your history, honor your ancestors, and help share the stories that have been silenced for far too long.